National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Perry Bellegarde. We are very honored that you're joining us on Context. You know, we actually are brokenhearted that Aboriginal women are 4 times more likely to be murdered than non-Aboriginal Canadian women. Why is their risk so high?
Well, again, we said it's a big issue in Canada, and it's not only a First Nations issue, it's everybody's issue in Canada. We initially thought there was only 600 missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, and then with the RCMP study we find out it's 1,200. And the demographics, the statistics are there, and they're probably just scratching the surface. They're probably even more. And so one of the reasons why we say we needed this inquiry is to really address the root causes. Why is that? Why are those numbers so high? Why are they so prone to violence? How do men view women? You know, like, their lives matter. Their lives are important. And so we got to keep devising strategies. We've got to start bringing together all levels of government to focus on an action plan to deal with this issue. And part of that action plan is what we're working on February 26th and 27th coming up. But as well, we're still pushing for that national federal public inquiry into missing murdered Indigenous women and girls to really get into the public education awareness, but allow for healing for the families, but as well to create a dialogue to open people's eyes that this is just not right, this is not proper, and to start looking at recommendations and solutions to deal with it.
National Chief Bellegarde, 90% of these women are murdered by someone they know, and the majority of the killers, of course, are men. What can be done about what we're calling the man problem?
Well, a lot of it stems from basically we're facing the intergenerational effects of cultural genocide via the residential school. And we all know that was a breakdown of the individual, that was a breakdown of the self, that was a breakdown of family, that was a breakdown of community. And so individuals, and a lot of them are men, coming out of that system don't know how to care, don't know how to love, don't know how to raise a family. You know, they were physically abused, they were sexually abused, they're not healthy people. So we're still feeling the effects of that system that was imposed on our people. Now we know that, we're aware of that. We're not going to live in the past. We've got to learn from the past and move forward. So part of the whole issue is our men gaining back their strength, gaining back their identity, really becoming who they're supposed to be in terms of protectors of the family. You know, we have a lot of unhealthy individuals because of the pain that they suffered. And so we need to start looking at wellness centers. We need to start looking at getting back to their elders' teachings of respect and love and caring and honesty and courage, humility, all those 7 teachings. We have to start coming back to that. And that's one way. If you're healthy as an individual and you start pointing the finger at yourself first rather than out here at other people, you're healthy as an individual. And then if you're healthy as an individual, you can start raising healthy families. So it really begins with looking at internally as individual people, but really start looking at wellness strategies, but coming back to our elders' teachings. That's part of the solution.
National Chief, how did you enter that journey of wellness? Tell us about your path to health.
Well, I was, again, just listen to the elders' teachings, the guidance, you know, the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical. All those have to be in balance. And for me, the message that I tell to our people, our young men and women is, you know, we really need 2 systems of education now as Indigenous peoples here in Canada now. We need the kindergarten to grade 12, we need the math and sciences, we need the technical vocational skills, we need to go to university, all those things over here. But equally as important, on the other hand, is this First Nations education, is what I'll call it. And what I mean is I'm referring to your language, your identity, your ceremonies, your traditions, all those things that make you an individual, a First Nations person. And you need both of them combined. You're going to be strong. And for me, I got first exposed to those teachings from the elders at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. It's now the First Nations University of Canada. And they had a strong elders component there as part of the education system. And just listening to their teachings, listening to their guidance, their words, and then starting to participate in the ceremonies, the sweat lodge ceremonies, the Sundance ceremonies. It really is about balance. And that's how, for me as an individual, became connected, if you will, and be able to walk in both worlds. And that's continually the message we give to our young people. Walk in both worlds, but know who you are. And those languages and those ceremonies are so key to our survival.
As we face this huge heartbreak of stopping this wreckage of violence, are you saying that this personal wellness approach is going to be part of your strategy towards national repair?
I believe it has to be part of that because it's our men doing that to our own people as well. And then, so we have to get that wellness strategy as part of the action plan. You know, we have to start looking at action-oriented strategies to deal with the root causes, from housing, inadequate housing, to deal with safe shelters, to deal with daycares, you know, to make sure that the women and girls have the proper supports in place. But as part of that strategy as well is to deal with the whole wellness of the individual and the wellness family, or for the family as a whole as well.
You shocked me when you put it bluntly that colonialism has made Canadians see Aboriginals as a problem and never a partner. And it's time for Canadians to see your people as a partner. I want to know what we should see. How does this have to work?
That's great, because that's all about, like, in Canada, it's such a beautiful country. And I've said this all the time, and I'll say it here as well, that we need to reach out and partner and rebuild the relationship we have with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. Canada is rated 6th in terms of the United Nations Human Development Index. It's up here. You apply those same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. So we need to close that gap. And we can only do that by reaching out to fellow Canadians, reaching out to members of Parliament, reaching out to the premiers, because there's a high social cost to that gap. So we need investments in housing, investments in education, investments in training, and even embracing new concepts like revenue sharing, like treaty implementation, embrace Aboriginal rights and title, you know, and so that's how we can really close that gap together. Because can you imagine what this country will look like if everybody else moves from 6 to 4, 5, 3, and then we catch up? It would be a huge, huge, wonderful place, and nobody's going anywhere. So we've always talked about, we shared this land, we shared these resources. We weren't meant to be poor in our own homelands. The principles of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between our peoples. It was not domination and not civilize, assimilate, and terminate the Indigenous peoples. It was peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. And I think if we put our minds and hearts together and we reach out and roll up our sleeves and get to those tables, proper policies and legislation can be put in place that respects inherent rights and treaty rights, and we can move forward together so our children and grandchildren can have a better future, better light at the end of that tunnel, Otinigan, in the future.
What treaty land are you sitting on in Ottawa?
Well, this is the Algonquin territory. The Algonquin, it's unceded territory, so this basically the Algonquin peoples here. So this is their traditional territory. So I'm Cree, I'm from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, but this is the Algonquin territory. So every time we gather, we acknowledge the traditional territory of the Indigenous nations that are here. So it's the Algonquin peoples. And so we acknowledge them and thank them for allowing us to gather and meet. And we always say in a respectful way, and that's part of getting our history into the school curriculums, you know, because Canada was not only founded on French and English, the two founding nations. That's what we're taught in school. But we have over 58 Indigenous nations in Canada that really opened up their arms and welcomed the people when they came across that big water. And we taught them how to live and survive on the land. And it was really about peaceful coexistence and respect. And that has changed now in 2015. You know, people view Indigenous peoples with that old stereotype that we're dumb, stupid, lazy, drunk on welfare. And that is so passé now. We see more and more of our young people getting educated. We see more and more of our young people walking in balance, getting healthy. And we're making great contributions to provinces and to the country. And that's what we've got to keep challenging, the racism that's there, the negative stereotypes, and break down those barriers. And it all begins by having a dialogue.
Let's go to these difficult statistics of racism in the Maclean's article. An Aboriginal boy is more likely to end up in prison than to graduate from school?
Exactly. You know, there's racism not only in Winnipeg, it is right across Canada. And there's systemic racism as well in the justice system. Why is it that there's a disproportionate number of First Nations people in that system? You know, in Saskatchewan, we're 15% of the population, but almost 70–80% of the jails are filled by First Nations people. You know, the statistic you just said, you know, it's the systemic. And so we've got to break down those barriers. And we've got to start creating dialogue between our peoples. so that we no longer are viewed in a negative light, and that those stereotypes. I've experienced racism. You walk into a store and you're followed around because First Nations person guy is going to steal something. When police are behind me, I'm just waiting on edge for their lights to come on, because they see a First Nations person driving the car, the light automatically going to get stopped. You see the issues in the healthcare system, where the gentleman, Mr. Sinclair, died waiting in the hospital. So there's so many things that have to be challenged, but it starts by breaking down the stereotypes, and it starts by creating a dialogue and a forum for that discussion to happen. We can't keep burying our heads in the sand about it.
Maclean's magazine made the comparison to American statistics and made the point that our racism problem with First Nations in Canada is worse than that endured by African Americans in the United States. Do you agree?
Again, it's right across Canada, and it is there, no question. And we've got to build partnerships, create the dialogue so that we start breaking down the racism that exists, both systemic racism and even when you hear racism on the street. It's got to be challenged, and it can be done in a respectful way. It can be done in a way that fosters acceptance of diversity. We don't all have to be the same. Like, we are Indigenous peoples, and we're not all Cree. We're Mohawk, we're Algonquin, we're Mi'kmaq, we're Blackfoot. We're Indigenous peoples. We have the inherent right to self-determination. And again, in our own homeland here, now called Canada, we weren't meant to be poor. We weren't meant to be downtrodden and viewed in a negative light in our own homelands.
But National Chief, help us understand the root issues of racism and colonialism that continue the problem of poverty.
It's the colonization and oppression. There's two things that really hurt Indigenous peoples in Canada. One was the imposition of the residential school system, which was cultural genocide, where the kids were taken away from their families at 5, 6 years of age and put into the residential school system. That's one thing. Yes, we're still feeling the effects of that. Then in 1876, the imposition of the Indian Act, where Indian people were put onto reserves. They weren't allowed to leave the reserve without a pass permit. They weren't allowed to sell their own cattle, sell their own grains without a permit from the Indian agent. So those two things really had a negative impact on people here, First Nations people. And it's basically all the other land and resources were taken and developed, and we were marginalized, kept on these reserves, out of sight, out of mind.
You know how impatient Canadians are. We live in a time of rapid social media change and the instant everything. We are bad at waiting. Speak to our impatience with this healing process.
It's going to take time, Lorna. Things don't happen overnight. You've got to work together. Reconciliation. We've had over 150 years of colonization and oppression. I always say 4 words can capture what happened to Indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island. First it was civilize the Indigenous peoples because they're pagan, assimilate the Indigenous peoples, then it was terminate the Indigenous peoples, and now it's integration. But integration can work both ways. And now because of the reconciliation process, we have to heal ourselves on both sides, and that's going to take time. We're still feeling the intergenerational effects of the residential schools and of the Indian Act, the imposition of the Indian Act. We want to work beyond those things, but it's going to take some time. I think we can do that if we can make key investments in education and training, accept that we are different as Indigenous peoples, that we have shared the land and resource wealth with everybody in this country, accept that we've got to change the curriculum so that treaties are taught in the systems, inherent rights are taught in that system, or even start looking at and embracing us as not a third order of government in Canada, but as a first order of government. Because that's where we need to start looking at and getting our laws respected, the Creator's law respected and recognized. And that's going to take some time, but I think we're up for the challenge, and I think we can do it.
Perry Bellegarde, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, thank you for joining us from Ottawa.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity, Laura.